closed caption button, CC at the bottom for closed captioning. And the little globe icon is there for interpretation. So please feel free to listen in your language of choice. Je vais répéter en français pour tout le monde. Bienvenue à Agir ensemble, les femmes pour une économie juste, une initiative unique et pan-canadienne des organismes communautaires et syndicaux. Aujourd'hui, et pour le reste de la conférence, c'est une grande opportunité pour la création des stratégies et la mobilisation pour la justice économique pour les femmes. Je m'appelle Sheetal Lodhia, pronom elle, et je serai votre modératrice pour aujourd'hui. Veuillez noter, s'il vous plaît, qu'on a quelque chose de technologique en bas de vos écrans. Par exemple, il y a quelques icônes en bas de vos écrans. S'il vous plaît, coupez vos microphones et vidéos si c'est possible et si ce n'est pas déjà fait. Il y a aussi une icône pour le chat et ça, c'est pour communiquer un avec l'autre. Vous pouvez discuter là et aussi partager des liens ou de l'information avec tout le monde. C'est aussi là où vous pourriez demander des questions aux panélistes, s'il vous plaît. Veuillez écrire dans votre langue de préférence. Il y a aussi un petit CC, ça c'est pour le sous-titre codé. Et à côté de ça, il y a le petit globe pour l'interprétation. Et vous pouvez choisir ça pour la langue que vous souhaitez écouter. Vous pouvez choisir la langue que vous souhaitez écouter. On a la traduction en direct. Before handing over the mic, we have some big thank yous. Avant de commencer, on a des gros merci à donner. En première, pour les traductions, Pamela Cousineau et Piotr Belinsky, our marvelous live translation experts. For closed captioning, le sous-titrage codé, merci beaucoup à Hannah Goddard-Rebstein. She's an articling, or they're an articling student at Cavaluxos. A special thank you to the Atkinson Foundation and Canadian Women's Foundation for their financial support of the Rising Together webinars. And very special thanks to the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, for sponsoring the live translation, which allows us to have this bilingual webinar series. Maintenant, je vous présente une des organisatrices, Jan Borowy, and I'd like to introduce one of the organizers, Jan Borowy, and hand over the mic.
Thanks very much. And welcome everyone. We wanted to start this evening's event with a very important land and settler obligations acknowledgement. So I'm the daughter of a second generation white settler and a first generation Polish settler. And Faye?
And I am a Filipina Armenian settler who grew up in Treaty 1 territory.
Yes. So we're holding this webinar on Turtle Island. We acknowledge and honor the First Peoples that have lived on Turtle Island for thousands of years. We acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous persons in the area for time immemorial. Our settlers before us failed to respect and acknowledge Indigenous peoples, practices, and ways of knowing. Settlers approach their relationships with First Peoples as one of cultural genocide, and settlers failed to abide by signed treaties and agreements with all First Peoples. So as one small act towards reconciliation, we acknowledge the land that we're meeting on, and as it is the traditional territory of many nations. So from where we're broadcasting this webinar today, we sit in Toronto and we sit near Algonquin Park, and this includes the territories and lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe and Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. This area is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Agreement and Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So we ask all participants on this webinar to reflect for a moment. Think about the land that we are inhabiting, but we very much ask that you take concrete steps and concrete action. There's much each one of us can do to work and push towards a full recognition of lands for all Indigenous peoples. And we hope, and may this Rising Together webinar and this entire series just be one small piece of that journey. Thanks. Sheetal, I think it's back to you.
Thanks, Jan. It's my pleasure to introduce Marie Clarke Walker, who is the CLC Secretary Treasurer, who will speak next.
Thank you, Sheetal, and welcome everybody. I want to say good evening and welcome back to those of you. I see some familiar faces who were on the Equal Pay webinar, so welcome back to all of you. If you remember correctly, we had some really good discussions on the impact of COVID on gender and the acknowledgement that women are impacted disproportionately and differently. The issues, childcare, housing, economic justice for women, they're the same. They're the same issues that we have been talking about for decades. And so what's different was the impact that it's had on different women during COVID and how we'll deal with that going forward. So the pandemic really didn't change the narrative for many. What it did was shine a light on existing inequalities. Inequalities that many in the union movement, community organizations, and women's organizations have been highlighting for decades. It further showed who was on the receiving end of the lack of concrete social protections, and in some cases, even the most basic protections were not provided to those who were and are still providing the very services that we all need to survive. These issues have always been one of the sources of contention for many of the workers that are in the sectors that are now affected, especially the care sectors, childcare, education, healthcare sectors, and long-term care, where we saw record numbers of deaths and record numbers of illnesses, and we're still pushing for an independent public inquiry. The crisis also demonstrated how important the work traditionally performed by women is. So in order to maintain the health and safety of communities. It showed everyone the importance of the jobs that have been traditionally undervalued and underpaid, the jobs that are casual, part-time, precarious in nature, and held predominantly by women, and for the most part, racialized women. Many of these same workers were deemed essential, and at the height of the pandemic were given pandemic pay, 24-hour childcare, paid sick leave. Some received personal protective equipment, but many were and still are underpaid, working in poor conditions with little protections, and still have unpaid responsibilities once they arrive home. For those who were working and are still working from home, when childcare and schools are closed, there is no separation at all as they perform the paid and unpaid under the same roof, all while having to be teacher, playmate to their children. It also shone a light on those who fell through and continue to fall through the cracks. People with disabilities, migrant workers, senior communities, the poor, marginalized, and invisible. Today, as we head towards complete reopening and recovery, many are still stressing. Mental health issues are of concern. The impending She session is looming, while governments making new announcements every day, whether it's announcing cutting pandemic pay, a new phase of reopening, the suspension of collective agreements. It is very clear to all of us that there has been little or no intersectional or gender lens used and little or no empathy for the current situation. The pandemic presented governments with, for the most part, a missed opportunity to be innovative, to ensure that during and after the pandemic, no one was left behind. So you would think now that the reality of their world has been made public for everyone to see during the pandemic, these workers who were heroes just a few weeks ago would now have respect, their jobs valued, would have higher wages, predictable hours, job security, paid sick days, emergency leave, support to meet their childcare needs, access to EI, health benefits, and more importantly, access to all the necessary equipment that they would need to keep them safe and allow them to do their jobs safely. Well, not so. Many are still struggling. There are many with mental health issues, domestic violence, more automated checkouts in the retail sector, healthcare workers that are still requiring proper protective equipment. Migrant workers who are here providing a much needed service, providing our food and care, are still dying in record numbers and still don't have any social protections. And all of this while we continue to see the reopening of sectors and cities and the numbers of people infected with COVID beginning to steadily increase again. We've seen both the positive and negative impacts of COVID. We called on governments to continue the positive measures put in place during COVID, but in many instances, it seems to have fallen on deaf ears. Friends, siblings, comrades, as we head towards what will be a new normal, women are still dealing with the same inequalities. The difference between now and all the other times is that I think we are at a critical moment, a moment where I really believe we have an opportunity to make change. We're at a fork in the road, both in terms of dealing with what will become the new normal for all of us, as well as the state of race relations in this country and around the world. We all now have a choice. Choose the road that we have always gone down, the one that's familiar and comfortable, and some will just want to tweak, or the new road, one that may be unfamiliar to some, uncomfortable to many, but addresses the inclusive and intersectional strategy that we will need for all women in order to make the changes. So to my sistren that are out there, to my comrades, we see you. We want to build a world that works better for you, where there is 24-hour childcare, where there are good jobs with living wages and benefits, where violence and harassment is a thing of the past, where no one has to worry about affordability of life's necessities, including childcare, pharmacare. We want a world that's free from homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ableism, a world free from discrimination, Islamophobia, and racism. A world where no one is left behind. And in order to do that, we must ensure that colonialism and patriarchy are not part of the equation. A world where Black lives matter so that all lives can matter. I look forward to the conversations over the next 5 months. I look forward to tonight's conversation because I think it is important. It's up to us. It's up to us as women to build our new just economy. And so we want to do that in a way that leaves no one behind. I thank you all for being here. I thank you all for giving up your time. And I look forward to the interactions over this webinar and the next 5 to come. And thank you for the invitation.
Many thanks to you. Many thanks to you, Mary Clarke Walker. I now pass the microphone to the organizers, Faye Faraday and Jan Borowy, who will set the context of this webinar series that will take place over the next 5 months.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my my screen with you so I can show you some slides. There, I hope that you see my screen now. This work that we've been doing is at this point a continuing effort of work. It isn't something that is simply in response to COVID. It is actually an ongoing effort to mobilize in an intersectional way across movements, across communities, to build the strongest ground possible for deep change. If you look at the logo for our gathering, it is a sun made up of dots converging together. And we did design it to represent all of us coming from our different places, our different locations, coming together, building something strong, but then like the rays of the sun going back out to mobilize more people. Back in April, we had one of our webinars. We were meaning to pull together people across the country in an in-person summit, and we've just moved all of that online. The goal of coming together across movements in a very intentionally intergenerational and intersectional way is to allow us to strategize and to get at those very deep structural and systemic drivers that, that produce and reproduce women's economic and social insecurity. And most importantly, we want to be able to come together to collectively build a vision of an economy and a society that leaves no one behind. We know that there are many different drivers of women's inequality and economically and socially in society. When we look at the level of women's work, there are many ways in which systemic discrimination is rife throughout the economy. One being that women have unequal access to jobs. There's discrimination in hiring and training. There's discrimination in the fact that women overwhelmingly have precarious job status, that they have a much higher percentage of precarious work, and that that precarity is deeper for women with disabilities, women who are racialized, Black women, migrant and immigrant women, and undocumented women. There's the concern that our society is not structured around women's lives. It's structured around women doing a lot of unpaid care work. And so women experience, as a result, a lack of access to enough hours for sustainable work. They continue to bear an unequal burden of unpaid care duties. There's gender-based violence that, that occurs in the workplace that drives women out of jobs, out of careers. But the way that women experience gender-based violence throughout society impacts their ability to access and hold on to jobs. Unionization was designed very much around a male work pattern in a much earlier era. And so the precarious kinds of work that women do are much harder to unionize. And we know that being able to act collectively, to unionize, to bargain collectively is the most significant contributor to rising wages in the workplace. And we continue to have a job market that is deeply segregated along gender lines, along race lines, and that there are very deep systemic wage inequalities that follow that segregation of the labor market. But underlying all of that, there are very deep ideologies that sustain and create that insecurity. We are continuing to live under the cult of austerity, although we've seen this shift in COVID to the recognition that we do need to contribute together and to build security together. We'll see how that shifts. There has been a cult of flexibility for employers, not for workers. We've had a sustained attack on the rights to unionize over the last number of decades, despite the fact that the right to unionize is a constitutionally protected right, as is the right to bargain collectively, as is the right to strike. We continue to have undervaluing of care work. Systemic racism, as we know, has deeply, profoundly structured our society in order to oppress, in order to marginalize, in order to extract labor in a predatory way. Colonialism is at the root of our society and continues again to displace Indigenous peoples from their land, to continue to impose the effects of attacking Indigenous culture, attacking Indigenous ways of knowledge, and the resulting social and economic insecurity, the cultural insecurity over a century and more of cultural genocide continues to exist. And our society is profoundly structured around a framework of ableism, so much so that it is something that we frequently overlook. And, you know, I will own our own need amongst our organization to pay much more attention to this. But all of these ideologies create and prop up a system of inequality. And so when we think about how to unpack things, it's very much a job of not just doing the tweaks in small ways that affect people in the workplace or in small locations, but digging deep into all these systemic drivers of inequality. And these systems exist because people profit off it. As I said, the work that we're doing has long predated the COVID pandemic. This is, I think, the third year of the work that we've been doing together, trying to build these conversations across the country. But with the impact of COVID, what we've seen is that all the fault lines in society that exist, that create oppression, have just been exacerbated. COVID didn't create that inequality, whether it's inequality for racialized workers, whether it's inequality for people with disabilities, whether it's the effects of colonialism and the lack of clean water. You know, if you look at all of the different structural roots, they were all there before. And each of the different experiences in COVID have amplified and exacerbated them, whether it's around the risk to women who are doing many of the high-risk jobs during the pandemic, the exacerbation of the gender pay gap, all the different forms of social and economic risk that women face in their full diversity, be through the precarious structure of women's work, and the incredible increase of gender-based violence that has grown along with the pandemic through the social isolation and stress and lack of access to services that women face. So all of those are very deep issues. None of them are new with COVID, but what we've seen is all of these drivers of structural inequality exposed in their fullest way. It's now an opportunity to demand change specifically to address those deep roots, because having seen it, having had it exposed, the choice to not address it is a choice that must be held for, if people make that choice must be made accountable. So Jan, I'll pass it over to you for looking at the impacts of where we are now.
Thanks, Faye. And in fact, I'm mindful of the time. Faye, these slides will be posted for everyone's benefit. And I can say that we have a number of slides that are available which provide you with statistics, which examine how the pandemic response has been built and anchored on an ableist framework. It's been intensifying of racism and colonialism. So I'll just want to make three basic points that we have across three slides. But let me say that part of the impetus for this project started some time ago because we realized this year was the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. There were over 100 recommendations made in 1970, some of which included things like a national childcare program. It identified the importance of women's participation in the economy, but what it identified the need to change, for instance, the Indian Act. But what is so striking at this particular point with COVID is the structural, deep structural and systemic discrimination that's in inequality that's existing in our labor market, is that in fact, what we're going to find is that women have suffered the most job loss during the pandemic, and I won't go through these stats. So that's point one, is that we are seeing a significant impact, unlike that we've seen in decades. So women have suffered the most with respect to job loss. The second point on our next set of slides is fundamentally, we are seeing, frankly, more women were laid off during the pandemic, so that we do have a she session, without a doubt. By comparison, it was women in particularly low-paid jobs being paid $14 an hour or less. More of those women were laid off compared to men, and more low-income workers were laid off than high-income workers. The third and last point I'll just make is what we call the women's care penalty. That will continue unless a recovery policy has a gendered focus. You know, it's been said that the impact of this she session will take us back decades. Women will not be participating in the labor market as they have over the last number of years. It's important to remember, if women even within some communities had the ability to participate in labor markets and had those options, we're seeing a complete contraction through this C session, which has a very specific gendered impact. And in fact, from a point of view, when one puts gender at the core and gender at the center of this, an intersectional gender analysis, we know that the recovery policy must address of women's specific issues. Now, these slides that we produced for you are just simply a springboard for our conversation. I'm so excited by the panelists that we have this evening, because frankly, each of these women come with a huge amount of experience and expertise, and will be able to deepen this analysis and really deepen our discussion of what we're going to need to get through, to create, to move from a she session to a she recovery. Faye, back to you.
So when you were registering for the webinar, we asked you a couple of questions around what the impact of COVID has been on you, and also what is it that you need? What do you think is needed to address where we are right now? The range of impacts that you gave were in incredible granular detail. The ways in which the quality of your life has been so profoundly affected, whether it's around access to work, access to services that people need on a daily basis for well-being, the incredible emotional and mental harm that has been caused through the stress, the lack of childcare, the increased care work, particular risks around health and safety and lack of PPE, impacts on students, the cultural and digital divide that has really been exposed through even sessions like this that we're doing online, but that many people can't access because of a lack of access to the internet. And the lack of social contact in the way that it affects how we work, how we connect with each other, how we're able to work with people who either we're providing services to or who we're trying to mobilize with. But importantly, when you responded to the question of what is it that we need, the responses overwhelmingly went straight to those really deep drivers of inequality. There were individual changes and reforms that were identified, but for virtually everyone, the responses drove right to those deep things like an end to austerity, the need for climate justice, the need to tackle white supremacy, decolonizing, land back, gender justice, economic justice, climate justice, access to high-speed internet, universal programs that provide for social supports, and importantly, people who are affected being at the forefront and at the center of creating the solutions. So over the next 6 months, we will be having a series of these webinars so that we can do a really deep dive into all of these issues. We will post these slides, we'll circulate them, so you can hold the dates for the ones that are coming up. Our next webinar in August will focus on the care economy. Then we will move to decolonizing the economy, anti-oppression, and the green economy in October. In November, we'll be looking at how we integrate all these different threads and principles of building a truly intersectional feminist economy. And then towards the end of November, we'll be focusing on mobilizing. Throughout this period, we are going to be hoping to identify moments where we can work together, when we can take advantage of moments to influence policy. And so I'm just giving you a reminder that the pre-budget consultations are coming up and submissions are due on August 7th. But that's just one moment. Throughout this period, we are hoping to build ongoing relations where we can support each other. We can amplify each other's voices. We can together, collectively, work towards those deep solutions for real change. And so again, as I said, our next webinar is August 12th with a fantastic lineup of speakers. And all of this is going to be building towards Monday, December 7th, which is the 50th anniversary of when the Status of Women report was released, at which point we will be having a public action and putting forward demands that we collectively build over the next 6 months, demands for real change. So just a note that for everyone who is on the webinar today, Dr. Pam Palmiter has a new book that's coming out in September. All of you are welcome to access the discount code. You can get a 10% discount. The code is Warrior10. And so I hope we'll all pick that up and put that on our reading list. But at any point through this process, please feel free to reach out to us. We are, as Jan said, putting together our website on the Equal Pay Coalition website has a series of pages devoted to the Rising Together project. We are building out a series of resources and that we can use as a knowledge hub for sharing information. So if you have reports, demands, fact sheets that you want to send to us, we are happy to post them on our website so that we can all learn together and build deeper, meaningful solidarity. So thank you.
Thanks so much to Jan and to Faye. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first panelist. Just keep in mind that I'm shortening some of these bios on the spot because we're a little bit behind in time. We've posted longer bios online, and so feel free to read them because they are impressive. Our first speaker is Pam Palmiter. Dr. Pam Palmiter is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, author, and social justice activist from Eel River Bar First Nations in New Brunswick. She holds the position of full professor and chair in an Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. A practicing lawyer for 22 years, Pam has been volunteering and working in First Nations issues for over 30 years on a wide range of issues like socioeconomic conditions, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and legislation impacting First Nations. Her current research focuses on police racism, abuse, and sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls, and its contribution to the crisis of murdered, missing, traded, and exploited Indigenous women and girls. I'd like to welcome Pam Palmiter.
Thank you so much for having me. Kwe Nindeloizi Pam Palmater, and I'm actually coming to you from Scugog territory tonight. So appreciate the land acknowledgement, and I'm sure that everybody here is on different territories. Thanks for including me on this panel. I think when we talk about the issue of a just economy, especially from a feminist perspective, it's absolutely critical that, you know, the lens of Indigenous women is there, because, you know, we are facing this trifecta crisis right now. We've got, you know, the COVID pandemic, which is disproportionately impacting Indigenous women who were already vulnerable because of the crisis of genocide that existed prior to the pandemic. And then the ongoing pandemic of racism, you know, which sits on top of sexism and dually disadvantages Indigenous women. And if you add disabilities to that in any way, you know, it's just such a profoundly different set of experiences and histories. And it's important that we include that, because while we're all working together in solidarity to advance women's rights in all areas, including the economy, we also have to recognize the very different, you know, historical experiences and current experiences and needs and demands of the different women in our, you know, solidarity group. But because of this, you know, COVID pandemic, you know, the genocide that was pre-existing, and this racism pandemic, this has created a situation where Indigenous women are subjected to disproportionate levels of violence, and it has a severe impact on their mental and physical health, and their abilities and disabilities, exceptionally high levels of poverty, the highest in the country, and impacts to their liberty and to their life and security. So liberty in terms of they have the highest incarceration rates, and in terms of their security, you know, their very safety, not just in their own homes, but in society, in government institutions. I mean, genocide and racism is so well ingrained in this society that it's hard to even think about the workplace or childcare when you're talking about life and death issues at home, when your kids are apprehended at crisis level rates. These are the primary considerations of many First Nations Indigenous women in this country, which that takes the conversation in a different direction. Our primary concern is not having our kids apprehended. We don't even get to have the conversation about going to work and having childcare, for example. But this situation isn't our doing. This is like pre-contact. Indigenous women are kick-ass warriors. You know, they were life givers and caregivers, and they raised their children and passed on the culture and language. That's true, and that's a very central, important element in who we were as nations. But we were also warriors, negotiators, political strategists, leaders, traders, translators. I mean, we occupied the most significant positions in all of our nations in all different ways, just like men did. And so colonization has had a profound impact on who we are as Indigenous peoples that isn't just historical. And I think, you know, the important point from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls is that when they found Canada guilty of genocide in terms of fact and law, they weren't just talking about historical genocide. They were talking about the genocide that continues today, and all levels of government having this manifest intention to destroy Indigenous peoples through carefully worded policies. So instead of saying assimilation now, they might say integration, but the impact is the same. The kind of education we get for the most part is not much different than what we got in residential schools. It's still English, French, it's still European history, it's still capitalist, economic ideologies and things like that, while our languages are at significant risk. So it's important to remember that this situation that we're in now, the so-called vulnerability, is not of our own doing. And in fact, it speaks to our incredible level of strength, resilience, determination, that we are still here, that we found ways to resist and survive, despite all the ways in which our culture or race was criminalized and our sexuality was exploited and abused. So this kind of dual disadvantage, where to be an Indigenous person and celebrate your ceremonies was outlawed. You weren't allowed to go and engage in your traditional subsistence economies or trade networks, because that was also outlawed. You weren't allowed to leave the reserve. And the settler governments and settlers, in fact, wanted to have all of those lucrative trade routes and economies for themselves. So in every way, our identity was criminalized, and our sexuality exploited in many different ways. So it leads us to this position where, when we're talking about a just economy, we have to have a very fundamental conversation about how, for Indigenous women, our economy starts first and foremost on the land, and land acknowledgements aren't going to get us there. So land acknowledgements are things that we can and should be doing, because it is a recognition that these are still our territories. However, without actually having our land base, that is the fundamental nature, it's the fundamental core of governments, of the economy of governments, of states, of peoples. And so that needs to be rectified, and all of the things that go with that. So all of the resources that come with that land base, which has impoverished Indigenous women. Otherwise, without having that land base and all of those resources, the only other alternative is assimilation, is to aspire to equality in the workplace, in Canada's workplace. And that's not going to help Indigenous women. The choice shouldn't be give up your identity and you can have some workplace benefits. It really needs to be recognition of our rights. So we're talking about lands and resources, but also our treaty rights. And treaty rights vary across the country for different First Nations. They include things that guaranteed trade protections. Like, it should be Indigenous women leading any conversations on international trade. And, try telling parliamentary and Senate committees that, and they laugh in your face, because it's a stereotypically male corporate dominated world from all of the wealth and resources on our lands. But if we were recognizing treaty rights, which protected these exclusive trading relationships, we would be at the head of the table. We would have things like healthcare paid for, education paid for. We wouldn't be having to sue the government all the time and waste those resources. Similarly, and very significantly, because we also had a meeting with the Minister of Indian Affairs today, they call themselves whatever nowadays, is the ongoing and historic discrimination in the Indian Act, the sex discrimination, and there's residual discrimination in the Indian Act today, but the many generations and hundreds of thousands of women and their descendants who were excluded from the Indian Act, denied essential programs and services, denied their treaty rights, denied their ability to live in their homes, suffer disproportionate rates of homelessness and things like that, all because of the Indian Act. So while Canada has made some amendments to the Indian Act, because of COVID, they are essentially stopping or slowing registration for Indian women and their descendants. So they're going around the country giving increased money to First Nations, saying that the programs and services that Indian Affairs provides to First Nations are essential services. But when it comes to women, no, well, COVID is a good excuse not to register you, and then you deny you access to those essential services. And when we pressed the minister today about, are you prepared to declare registration an essential service, they weren't prepared to do that. So we've got a long way to go when it comes to Indigenous women and children. And that includes things like post-secondary education. So if we're being underfunded on things like education from K to 12, child and family services, and post-secondary education, what do you think our prospects are in the workplace, to get into the workplace, you know, to be able to be having the conversation around things like childcare or unions or work protections or parental leave and things like that? Very difficult. And while Canada would have us believe that things are improving, if you look at the socioeconomic data over the last 20 years, it actually shows things getting worse on every socioeconomic indicator. So things like health, suicide, mental health, infant mortality, chronic diseases and illnesses, homelessness, suicides, addictions, murdered and missing, over-incarceration, and things like human trafficking and exploitation. So it's not a situation where people can just point out a few examples and say, look, there's a few that are doing okay, so everything must be okay. It's very much invisible. For the most part, many of these communities, especially First Nations and remote communities, are out of sight, out of mind. And that includes the solidarity networks who aren't necessarily tied in at the community level, or there's not enough resources or even technology for these communities to be tied into these networks. So the very worst case scenarios are not being properly represented. And so
Pam, there's about 1 minute.
Yep, that's fine. So our vision of a just economy is really based first and foremost on a recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada. I mean, they're in theory already protected under the Constitution. They're now protected under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They're protected in treaties, which are constitutionally protected, but they're breached more than they're honored. And we have made submissions to Indian Affairs. We have made submissions to the status of women. We continue to go to the United Nations, and specifically on COVID, we have made submissions and said, you need a COVID action plan specific to Indigenous women and girls that includes economic considerations. We've made submissions to the United Nations. Just recently, the Feminist Alliance for International Action we made a joint submission outlining, here's all the data, here's what's going to happen, you know, what's happening during COVID, here's what's going to happen post-COVID, unless you take Indigenous specific action, which includes recognizing all of these rights.
Thank you so much, Pam. I encourage all of you to put your questions in the chat box, and we will ask the presenters after everybody has had a chance to speak. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Angela McEwen. Angela McEwen is the Senior Economist at the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, and a Policy Fellow with the Broadbent Institute. She produces a quarterly publication for CUPE, Economy at Work, that examines Canadian economic trends and public policy from a worker's perspective. Please welcome Angela McEwen.
Thank you. That's quite the act to follow. Thank you, Pamela, for sharing all of your wisdom and insight. I'm going to be talking about how we take all of the knowledge that we're going to be sharing today in this webinar and the conversations that hopefully we'll continue to have after that, and use that to get our governments to actually spend money where it would make a difference. So as others have said, the pandemic didn't create any new divisions, it exacerbated existing ones. And so your recommendations will likely be very similar to the ones that you had before the pandemic, but that makes sense. That's completely natural, because capitalism and inequality and racism were causing huge amounts of harm before, and governments and budgets weren't taking them seriously. The federal government has implemented what they call a gender budgeting plus analysis, and they're starting to look at more data on a different, trying to be intersectional and get more information about what is it like for women with disabilities, what is it like for new immigrants, but they are still learning, and there's a long way to go in that process to help them understand. So as Faye mentioned earlier, there is a timeline where you can hook into this process and try to get some attention for the issues that you're working on. So the first deadline is August 7th, so you can submit 2,000 words on August 7th. Once you've submitted it, you submit it through their website. Once you've submitted it, it actually goes online as well, so then you can share it from there with others, and others can see, you can go on there and see what other people have submitted as part of their budget recommendations. And then in the fall, the Parliamentary Committee has hearings, and they may invite you, if you've submitted something, they may invite you to come and present in person or via webinar, where you can expand on what your organization or what you as an individual are recommending the government can do. So, and participating in this budget process. So when we make a submission or when we write this data, it can give us a hook to tell our stories to the broader public as well. Because often just making a submission to a government committee isn't going to get you very far. Like Pamela, I mentioned to several government committees that maybe childcare would be a really good economic strategy, and I've had the whole committee laugh at me. So they don't take us seriously. They don't take care work seriously. And if you think about the economy, care work props up the whole economy. If you extend the concept of care work to our relationship with the land and our relationship with our environment, then it really does. It holds up the whole economy. It's the basis for how we live our lives. And so it should be at the center for the government budget of how we get a just economy up and going again. But they're not going to do that unless there's widespread public pressure. And so it is helpful in the pandemic that the threads that connect us have been exposed in some way and have made our cases for us. In long-term care, this is an example where it became clear that the way that the workers were treated in long-term care had an impact on whether or not people survived or were able to make it through without contacting COVID-19. And so we've shown in a really awful way, it's shown how having been made vulnerable before had a bigger impact now. And so that makes the case to the broader public in a way that maybe it was hard for us to do beforehand. And so we need to use that hook and the hook of that budgeting process to make our case to the broader public that the government needs to focus on these priorities. And as we know, governments and politicians will always say what you want them to hear. So how do you know that they're making it a real priority? Well, you have to follow up with the numbers. How much are they spending on this priority? How much is reasonable? If you look at the recent agreement that was struck between the federal government and the provinces, there was $600 million for childcare, and the childcare now recommended that it was $2.5 billion at least that they needed. So when you have the recommendation from an organization that lays out the case, that says this is what we need, and governments aren't providing that funding, then you know that the money isn't where their mouth is. And so the last thing I want to say about this is that we absolutely can afford it. You can engage in the budgeting process at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level, but right now, the federal government has been, since 1995, they've been backing out of funding the social part of the economy. And they've done that when they capped transfers to First Nations communities at 2%, regardless of population or inflation. They've done that when they capped transfers to provinces. They have paid less and less of healthcare. They've paid less and less of social assistance. Other parts of the economy where they've taken less room. And so now we're at a point where the federal government definitely has a role to play, where they can afford to come back in and spend large amounts of money. Even though they've already spent large amounts of money on the pandemic relief, that's okay. We're in a situation here where the Bank of Canada can actually sell bonds, buy the bonds from the government, and that money we owe ourselves. And so it's fine, it's okay. And the government has even recognized this. Justin Trudeau said that they took on debt so that Canadians didn't have to. And so our job is to make the case that they need to continue doing that to build a strong economy, a fair society going forward. They can absolutely afford to. There's a role for the federal government to do this, and that also helps, if you're thinking in a pan-Canadian perspective, make sure that all provinces are getting similar levels of support and similar benefits in terms of healthcare, because we know whether you live in Newfoundland or Ontario, you need your medication paid for. And so that shouldn't be tied to having a good job. You should actually just be able to get the medicine that you need without going broke or having your employer pay for it. So I think that these are really important things. And I think it's important for us actually as women to understand that these things are the economy. These things should be taken seriously. They're the ones who are wrong for laughing at us. These are critical pieces of the economy. And it's absolutely clear now that if childcare centers and schools are closed, huge parts of the economy are going to be shut down and simply will not be able to function without us. And so how do we advocate for something going forward? It's going to need a lot of cooperation and a lot of work, because obviously we want teachers to be safe. We want to take into consideration who's going to be left behind and how we can make sure that that we're thinking about everybody when we're making our recommendations. And so I think this conversation is really useful in terms of framing a response, because some of us who are feeling impacted right now weren't impacted before. And so some of this is new for people. They're not sure. Their eyes are being opened in a way that I think is quite useful, and we should take advantage of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I will introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Elle Jones, who is a spoken word poet, an educator, journalist, and a community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She's a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. Elle would like to pay tribute to the many nameless and unrecognized women whose work makes it possible for her to be here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Elle Jones.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody. I apologize for my voice. I don't have COVID. I have like communicating in collective movement stress. So sorry that I sound a little, but we'll get through this. I really want to thank everybody, and thank you, Pam, for sharing that knowledge. Thank you, Andrea, and everybody else. But I particularly want to thank Bonnie, I believe is speaking next, for her just tireless work in pushing all of us as women, as feminists, to really be intersectional in our feminism, and in particular around considering the rights of women with disabilities, who are so often, almost always, invisibilized, left out of our movements, denied access, and not spoken about. So I really want to thank Bonnie for the work she did today as we were preparing for this panel, and really pushing us as panelists and as organizers to really take accountability for how women with disabilities had been left out, and also pushing us to think about that and include that in the way we were thinking. So I really thank Bonnie for doing that work for us. And of course, I know Bonnie will talk more about this, but as many of my remarks will also talk about prisons, I think it is appropriate to say that we recognize that things like the global prison industrial complex, when we talk about women as the fastest growing group of incarcerated people. Indigenous women is overwhelmingly, of course, incarcerated in Canada, with 42% of our federal population, prison population, being Indigenous women, and Black women being the fastest growing global population. We also recognize that it is women with disabilities who are overwhelmingly being incarcerated, including women with things like brain damage from trauma from domestic abuse, who are breaching because they can't keep their appointments because they literally have lost their short-term memory from being thrown against walls and kicked. Something that prison advocates have long known, but yet continues to criminalize women who are actually experiencing quite literal physical trauma and then are being criminalized for it. So these are really important points of intersection, and as we speak, it's really important that we recognize that. As we're talking about labor, much in the spirit of Pam's comments, where she began by saying, sometimes we're not even at the point of being able to talk about the job because we're still, Indigenous communities are still dealing with genocide. They're still dealing with the social worker coming to your hospital room to take your baby off your breast. For Black women, we always have to recognize that the very notion of labor is at the heart of enslavement, right? Black people were enslaved in order to provide exploited labor in the Americas, in so-called Americas in particular, due to the genocide of Indigenous people. So 95% of the Indigenous populations of the Americas being wiped out within a century of Spanish contact is actually what then turns African enslavement into so they turn to Africa and say enslave Africans instead. So we recognize this shared history, and of course, this notion that still impacts Black people in our labor, that we were beasts, that we were animals, that we could slave in the heat without suffering its effects. And then of course, the mass rape and sexual assault of Black women, the industrial style rape that took place during enslavement and beyond. We often talk about lynchings of Black men and don't talk about, you know, the sexual assault of Black women, which is also a lynching that also took place in the same time period, including lynchings of Black women, by the way. So I say this to say that any conversation about labor in the Black community has to begin with this acknowledgement that Blackness is always being tied to the exploitation of our labor, and we continue to not have our labor recognized and honored. Part of anti-Blackness is, of course, the belief that Black people become public bodies, and therefore everything can be extracted from us with no compensation, and we have no right to it. And then, of course, it is only valued when upon the bodies or in the communities or as the labor of other people. So I do want to tie this and this notion of extracting labor to the global prison industrial complex. We know, as I said, that Black women are one of the fastest growing rates of incarcerated populations globally, and we do tie this to questions of the economy. We know the prison industrial complex is, of course, in itself, that's the point of it. It is a economic engine. We build prisons not only to create so-called economic opportunities, many times in communities that have been stripped of their traditional resources. So in Nova Scotia, for example, Spring Hill has a prison. It used to be a mining town, right? So the mine closes. How do you find an economic engine? You build a prison. Renous Prison, the max for our region, is in only 20 minutes really away from where Rodney Levi, an Elmu man, was murdered by police. So we recognize these kind of connections that are taking place in the prison industrial complex. But also people in Miramichi have said, well, you know, when we thought when the prison was built, we would get jobs. You know, so you have these communities that are being stripped of their resources. And then you have, for example, kitchen workers at Renous that are women that are coming in and participating in that system because they believe it, you know, giving them some kind of economic engine. So we recognize the connection between these systems. In Nova Institution for Women, which is the federal prison for women in the Atlantic region, they have a sweatshop there, essentially, the Corcan shop. And what they do is like sew underwear for the men's prisons and also blankets. So you have Indigenous women that, you know, in history were given smallpox blankets in order to kill the community, now sewing blankets for the military in a sweatshop in prisons. So we can, again, make these kind of ideological connections. So I did want to connect these current movements when we're talking about defunding the police, defunding prisons, defunding the military. Those are all economic issues, right? The conversation we are having now is fundamentally an economic one about where do we put our resources? Do we value punishment? Do we value, you know, harming people? Do we value criminalizing people? It costs $271 a day to keep somebody in jail provincially. During COVID, we were able to take 50% of people out of the prison because it became a public health risk to everybody, not because they cared about the prisoners, because they cared about the guards, and they cared about the guards coming in and going to community. So all of a sudden, we discovered that we could reduce our prison population by 50%. We also discovered that we could house like homeless people in hotels, something we were told that we never could do. So all these things that we've been told that are just fantasies and fairy dust and this is ponies. All of a sudden, when it was a necessity during COVID, we learned that we can house homeless people, that we can have safe injection sites, that we can get rid of prisons, and we can decarcerate. And now, even though it was much cheaper, it was only like less than $125 a day to keep people in supported housing, the provincial government has actually cut that program and is returning everybody into jail. So we are literally like, this thing doesn't work, it's cheaper, our communities were fine and safe when people are out of jail, but we still are going to put people in jail. So one of the things that I think COVID opened, as much as COVID obviously so exacerbated and revealed, if people didn't already know, the existing social gaps. COVID is not a moment, it is a process, right? It is part of an ongoing process of racism and colonialism and sexism. And it revealed that to us in very stark ways, these things that already existed, that some people get to sit at home safe and some people, working class people, racialized people, get to be on the front lines risking COVID. But it also opened other possibilities where we began to see that we can let people out of prison, that we can actually house people safely, that we can take care of each other. People started talking about things like community care and bringing each other groceries and mass solidarity, all things that we've been told we can't do. So I really want to point to that when we talk about the economy, to me, we are not talking about jobs as such. Economies are also economies of care. Economies are also, we cannot build an economy if it's not built upon a sustainable community of care where we grow our own food, where we are in relation with Indigenous people. We cannot have justice and any kind of reasonable economy on stolen land. There's no such thing as anything on stolen land that is just. So we cannot run an economy and then say we're going to make a just economy for women on the backs of Indigenous women. So we understand in this moment that in order to build the things we want, we have to build them upon defunding those apparatuses that continue to maintain inequality and actually funding things like care and mutual solidarity and healing and treatment and housing, that public safety is not maintained upon the bodies of Indigenous and Black and queer and trans and women with disabilities being stripped of their rights, incarcerated and marginalized. Public safety is created when everybody is safe and secure. So I want our economic conversation to be less about money and wealth and capitalism and much more about the wealth that we have when we care for each other in communities that we can build through this kind of solidarity. I did want to say a bit about racism during COVID. In Nova Scotia, North Preston, the largest Black community in Canada, one of the oldest Black communities in Canada. So, you know, when COVID was brought by like white people vacationing the States, like rich people coming back, you know, we were all told not to stigmatize COVID, like, which is true, we shouldn't stigmatize COVID, but you know, all the cases in the province initially before those community spread was travelers, snowbirds, as they say. And then people in North Preston, many of whom were working in the long-term care homes, got COVID, and the Premier and the Health Minister, the public health official, top doctor guy, Robert Strang, said that we caused COVID because we were acting recklessly and selfish and partying, and that they were worried that we were going to spread COVID to the rest of the community. So when it was white people getting COVID and spreading it, that was like, don't stigmatize it. And then when Black people got COVID, we became the contamination, which is of course the very logic of anti-Blackness, right? That Blackness is contamination and we must be policed and controlled to prevent our dangerous, criminalized, contaminated bodies from moving around with everybody else. But of course, many of the women, as I said, that had COVID were actually workers in our long-term care homes. And of course, these long histories of stripping those homes and particularly stripping out the healthcare industry, stripping out many of these industries where women are the frontline workers, resulted in the deaths of multiple seniors, like this complete crisis in our care homes, particularly of Black seniors that were in the Northwood care home. So there was this very racialized dynamic, and a lot of Black women, elderly Black women that had no other options but to be in a long-term care home were dying. I also want to recognize the Black women largely that were on the front lines of healthcare. Canada does not keep race-based stats when it comes to Black people. There's not race disaggregated data, so we don't know, but we know in the United States that Black people like disproportionately died of COVID. We can guess that Canada with the same conditions, Black and Indigenous people and people with disabilities, these are the communities that are also dying of COVID. I also want to cite the migrant workers. 3 migrant workers have died in Canada of COVID. Many more have been infected, yet Canada, of course, did not extend healthcare to migrants and people without status during COVID. And to this day, we have migrant workers that we need for the agricultural industry, many of whom are Black, many of whom are brown, Black, racialized people coming into this country and having to sign waivers saying if they get COVID that they are not entitled to any kind of compensation, that they can be kicked out of the country. And we have not extended any kind of benefits. They're not eligible for benefits when they lose their jobs. So that tells us not just that we should give people these temporary benefits, but in fact that we need status for all. That of course, we cannot continue to run an economy based upon foreign capital being able to move in now. Walmart can move in and now, and Amazon can come. You know, when Amazon wanted to come here, oh my gosh, don't pay your taxes. Like, we will build roads for you. But Black and brown bodies cannot move themselves from one place to another without being deemed illegal, incarcerated, as if our bodies are illegal on land that is stolen. So I really, really want to cite that. Canada recently, of course, within the last few hours, got rid of the safe for third-party country agreement. But I remind us that no country is safe when it is based on genocide, when it is based on anti-Black racism, when it is based on ableism, when it is based on misogyny. So to say, okay, Canada doesn't think America is safe anymore. Well, America was never safe. Trump didn't make America unsafe. America has never been safe, and Canada is not safe when we have thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, when we have Black children in immigration detention, over 118 children in detention, when you can be held in indefinite immigration detention in Canada, and when Black women's labor continues to be stripped from us, exploited, removed from our communities. Black women continue to be subjected to sexual violence. Black kids as well as Indigenous kids, as Pam so eloquently said, like, we can't even parent our own kids without them being taken off our breasts, quite literally off our breasts at the hospital, and put into child welfare systems, and then criminalize them, put them through the youth justice system, strip them of education. Our kids can't even go to school to even think about getting a job when the police are handcuffing 5-year-old Black girls in the Peel region and taking them out of school, and when neurodivergent kids are being locked in closets in Edmonton that allows essentially solitary confinement to be imposed upon children in a school environment, most of those kids of whom are Indigenous and who are also kids who are living with autism or other so-called challenges, because our education system removes non-conforming children in all kinds of forms: racial kids, kids with disabilities, Indigenous kids, and gender non-conforming kids that are all removed from our system. I also, of course, in saying women, very much want to say that this is an all-inclusive definition of women, including trans women, including non-binary people who are women identified as well. So we recognize that, you know, we're not just talking about cis, straight women when we are talking about this. So I think that's it for, yeah, that was it. You were just about to break in. So as Pam, I just really want us to acknowledge that we cannot build an economy or jobs without coming to terms with and reckoning with the long history of anti-Blackness that makes this country possible, that has driven our economy. 25% of the economy in Halifax is based upon slavery when slavery existed, and our merchants actually petitioned Parliament against the end of slavery. And we continue to be invested in global white supremacy in this country. So we cannot build a just economy for women upon the backs of Africa, upon our mining companies going around the world and committing genocide, upon destroying the sovereignty of Africa through military action, and again, of course, on stolen land. So justice, economic justice for Black women looks like ending prisons, it looks like ending policing, it looks like ending the military, and it looks like returning to care and healing and transformative justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elle. I'd like to just give a little bit of a time check-in for all of our participants here. So we will likely finish, the speakers will likely finish just past 9 o'clock at about 9:05. So I'd just like to let everybody know that that's the case tonight. And if we're to have questions, they're likely to go till about 9:15. So we understand if those of you have other time commitments, feel free to leave the chat. There will be recordings put up on the website, and all of the questions will be available there too, as well as speaker bios. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Bonnie Brighton. She is a recognized leader in both the feminist and disability movements. She has been the National Executive Director of the Disabled Women's Network, DAWN, Canada, since May 2007 and is based in Montreal. As the ED of DAWN, Bonnie has proved herself as a formidable advocate for women with disabilities here in Canada and internationally. She has worked diligently to highlight key issues that impact the lives of women and girls with disabilities. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Bonnie Brighton.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And of course, I want to thank my panelists. And of course, I won't get a chance to thank her afterwards, so I'll thank our last panelist as well, because as we all know, Frances is going not to be the at last, she'll be first, Frances. I'll just leave it there. So I shared something in the chat box, and I really feel it's an important way to frame what it is I have to say tonight, because as was pointed out by Elle, it was a really challenging process to participate in this conversation, and not because I don't think the intentions were good for us to participate, but because systemic discrimination is a very real thing, and because ableism is, I think, the ism that we have the biggest challenge with still when we start to talk about discrimination. And as I said in the chat box, power imbalances are complex and systemic discrimination is hard to root out because it's so ingrained that it disappears into unconscious biases of language and thought, which makes it hard to combat. And I will say it was just really a difficult and challenging thing for me to come forward tonight and participate in tonight's discussion, but I was encouraged by the response from the organizers and of course from my fellow panelists. I also want to thank Catherine Scott, who spent some time earlier today preparing me for what was under the auspices of really focusing on the economy, but I think the discussion has gone broader tonight, and it feels important to me. Well, I think it's important to talk about those things, and there are a few things I may touch on to say that I want to start with really, putting down some clarity around where we are right now. And I want to thank Ellen, especially for, reframing this around something that is not about money and not about the economy in the way that perhaps some people wanted to talk about it, because it has to be framed from a human rights perspective first. And I don't think that that's not understood, but I do think that we have to think differently about what that means. And I want to make the point that this year is Dawn Canada's 35th year in service, and it's not a celebratory year. It's a year for reflection, and it's a year to prepare, I believe, for what really requires an all-in approach to how we change and move the dial for women and girls with disabilities, because apparently the statistics and the data are not enough. As many of you have heard or may have picked up, nearly a quarter of all women in this country live with a disability. 1/4, 24%, and that's a statistical number, and we know based on anecdotal research that the number is in fact higher than that. And I don't know, too, how many of you also understand that the majority of human rights complaints in this country for more than 5 years have been disability related. And that these are all indicators of where we have to start. And in understanding that an intersectional approach requires the centering of marginalized women, that we understand that if we don't start with that 24%, with the women who've been the most invisibilized in this COVID crisis, the most deeply affected when we add the intersections of race and gender to who has been affected, that we understand that that's where we have to start. Dawn Canada will be coming forward and challenging many of you and our governments and our colleagues in the civil service and in the private sector and in the unions to engage in a 10-year plan. And a 10-year plan means a real commitment, not talk, real commitment. I think it's really important to talk about the connections in terms of some of the conversations we've had, because, we talked, and Pamela talked about a just economy, and then went on to talk about Indigenous women and genocide. And in the context of COVID-19, to be really clear, the conversation has been about eugenics. The conversation has been at the provincial level, at the healthcare level, about whether or not people with disabilities should in fact receive healthcare in that context. And so you can imagine, again, for women with disabilities, what that has meant in terms of going to seek healthcare with a genuine fear that what they will be faced with instead is no choice, no assistance. I'll bring into the same conversation that it is Black women, Indigenous women, and women with disabilities, and gender diverse women who have faced and continue to face forced sterilization. I think it's, sorry, I'm going back to my notes, I apologize. The economic choices for 24% of women are not clear, are invisible. The human and economic cost of ableism at this point is one that we cannot continue to support. COVID, as was mentioned by Elle, is a process, and we can think differently about that process. I think I'll go through a few of the key points that I had planned to raise around the economic issues, starting with, I think, an important question for all of us to ask ourselves, because we have been talking about disaggregated data, And in terms of the disaggregated data about COVID-19, I think the frame we have to start with is who has died, whether it was from COVID-19, whether it was from suicide, or whether it was from MAID. That we understand that when we are talking about vulnerable women, marginalized women, that is what we are facing in the context of COVID-19. And that COVID-19 has failed to systematically unpack the needs of women with disabilities, their fundamental access to healthcare, the security of their person, and their ability to live their lives on their own terms. To understand again that we're talking about triage protocols that denied women with disabilities their fundamental right to healthcare and to life itself is the reality that women with disabilities across this country have faced throughout and continue to face through this pandemic. That women with disabilities have experienced heightened gender-based violence during this pandemic with nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. That the federal government stood and used supports for people with disabilities as a political football, as did the opposition parties, rather than making that a priority and not understanding that, again, the people most affected, again, by this pandemic will be shown to be people with disabilities because of all of the issues that have already been raised by my colleagues, and all of them being the same issues that were there before the pandemic and only being amplified by that. Examples of that would be that we are and continue to be represented as women with disabilities doing the majority of caregiving in this country. I think it's important for me to remind people that when we're talking about women in prisons, as Elle and Pam had raised, that the overrepresentation of women and girls in prisons has been well documented, and that it is, as has been pointed out, linked to the fact that women become disabled through violence, and especially women who are racialized and Indigenous. And that if you're going to talk about the workers who have been most forgotten, if we talk about sex workers, for example, that 35% of sex workers have self-identified as women with disabilities, with long-term disabilities before becoming sex workers, then we begin to understand who we are talking about when we're talking about who's being affected by this pandemic. And that what we are still looking at is no investments and no commitments from federal, provincial, or territorial governments. Dawn Canada's completed extensive research. Many of you may be familiar with a campaign we had called More Than a Footnote, which showed over and over again that women and girls with disabilities, as is the case with COVID-19, are footnoted in policies. And a footnote in policy for 24% of women in this country is an unacceptable number. I have a lot more to say, but we don't have enough time left, and I really want to leave enough time for Francis to speak and for there to be a wrap-up, so I'm going to step away from the microphone without having had the chance to really, I think, leave us with enough. And I would say that I appreciate the fact that there has been enough discussion about this, that I will suggest that I think that there needs to be further discussion and a deeper focus, as you've heard from the other panelists, in terms of the understanding that, as I said to all of you tonight, 24% of women in this country have been forgotten. 24% of women in this country were nearly not at the table tonight. And I don't mean physically here, but I need you to understand that it can't be because I am here, because I am talking, that we are talking about this, because millions and millions of women across this country are waiting for us to stand together. And if we are going to rise together, then we are going to need to center the most marginalized women. And I don't mean talk about centering, I mean actively centering in conversations, in policy, in recommendations, and in our movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Our last speaker, certainly not least, Senator Frances Lenkin. Frances Lenkin has been a lifelong advocate for workers' rights and women's rights. Senator Lenkin served for 11 years in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario from 1990 to 2001, holding the position of Minister of Government Services and Chair of Management Board, Minister of Health and Long-Term Care, and Minister of Economic Development and Trade. She also spent more than 10 years as the CEO of United Way Toronto. Senator Lankin is a member of the Privy Council and a member of the Order of Canada and was appointed to the Senate on March 18th, 2016. It is my great pleasure to welcome Senator Frances Lankin.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm thrilled to have been invited to join this conversation. And I am so wowed by all the women who have spoken already. You know, I'm getting up there in age now, and you know, at 66, long way to go, but at 66, I am thrilled to hear the depth of analysis and the passion, and to, you know, see the kind of years of work that these other panelists and many of you who have joined us, you know, have been doing. So I'm happy about that, but I'm also, you know, a little bit depressed because when I was 20, I began this work, and we're still talking about these same issues. And you know, we've made progress, we've lost progress, we've lost progress. But as everybody has said, these issues predate the pandemic, but the pandemic has exacerbated and deepened the equality gaps and the inequality impact on people, particularly women, particularly disabled women, women of color, Black women, and Indigenous women. And it does feel in some ways like this is a never-ending struggle. I remember when I used to teach union courses, and we did a film about the garment workers and the factory fire in the United States, and the song in the background was a really powerful song I found, and it talked about freedom, and it talked about you've got to fight for it, you know, you've got to struggle for it, and you've got to keep that up, you know, every day and night for it. And it ends the chorus with the line, and every generation has to do it again. And it seems that, you know, that bears true, and we have much work to do. And I'm pleased to see, you know, the youth of some of the panelists and the people who have joined us who put their energy into this. So that is terrific. I am not going to repeat what others have said. You've had a really amazing analysis from some really wonderful women. And I am going to focus on, at the federal level, what are some of the things happening and where can we put our efforts behind and widen those efforts. And I know that the organizers of this and the series of webinars will be building to a mobilization. But as was pointed out with the federal budget process and other opportunities, there's a moment to take continued action now. It's not that people haven't been taking action, but there's a moment. So federally, let me just talk about the world that I'm living in mostly right now, in collaboration with other senators, primarily women senators, but there are some terrific male allies as well who have been working with us on these issues. So before COVID, Senator Kim Pate introduced an inquiry on basic income. And many of us have been working with that. You may have heard that there was 50 senators we recruited to sign a letter going to the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and asking them to take this opportunity to transition CERB to a basic income approach. We have been working with grassroots community organizations and with the network, the Basic Income Canada Network. A few things have come out of that which I think are really important. That group has landed on using the language of basic income. That's a move away from the years that I've been working on this, calling it a universal basic income. And in more recent times, people calling it a guaranteed livable income. All of these things are descriptive and important, but they mean different things to different people. And we have done some considerable work to zero in on what we're talking about right now in the opportunity for post-COVID and recovery. And I think what everybody is talking about really in terms of a just recovery and a just economy and just society is reimagining as we come out, you know, as we are heading into recovery, when we come out of recovery, let's reimagine what our society can be, and let's address a number of these things. So the basic income work is ongoing. There's also been communications from the Parliamentary Anti-Poverty Caucus, which has MPs and senators on it, who have, you know, a number of government MPs who are part of that, who have written as well, calling on the government to transition CERB to a basic income. Basic Income Network has been posting and working with groups to do case studies. So there was a very well done and well covered case for artists and performers, and understanding the need for basic income for that group. The next one that they will be posting is about women, and just a couple of statistics that they use, which builds on Faye's slides earlier, but which I think when you relate it to COVID right now, I think is really illustrative of, you know, what we're seeing. So they talk about that 50% of reduced hours, women's work in essential workplaces have been reduced by 50%. And we've seen more, and that women make up 92% of nursing jobs, 80% of medical lab technicians, 75% of respiratory therapists, 90% of personal support workers, 99% of childcare providers, 70 to 80% of community and social service jobs, 84% of cashiers, 72% of food prep, 71% of cleaners, all of which are essential jobs as we go through this COVID. Excuse me. And others have talked about, you know, we saw additional danger pay, we might call it, provided for some of these jobs, and now being taken away again by employers. So there is no guarantee that that things will change, and that the kind of recognition that we have seen in the early days of this pandemic will stick in people's minds, and we have a job to do to make sure that happens. So there will also be a case coming forward, I believe, with respect to women and disability. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a dry throat tonight. So we look forward to that, and I would ask people to check in and to see what you can do to mobilize more letters to the government, mobilize sharing the information. Let's do some education around the possibility here. I also have a motion on the floor of the Senate to do a study on the future of workers in the gig economy. As we know, job precarity is continuing to grow. We're seeing a complete breakdown in the employer, in terms of security, in terms of benefits, in terms of pensions. I'm hopeful that that motion will pass when we return in the fall, and that we'll get that study going. It's important to bring forward a number of recommendations. And in some, you know, cases, we have to realize that there's been a complete restructuring of the economy around work. And what does that mean for workers? What are the protections that we need? And if it's not going back to the old way, how do we build in the right protections in this new economy and reimagine how this can be? We have a number of motions on the floor. One in particular that has the Black Caucus of the Senate and did the work to pull together, and many of us who are allies are taking, following their leadership and supporting them. And in that vein, we have a motion on the floor for a committee to focus in on anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism and systemic racism. Not to study it again. I mean, you know, Lord knows, when I spoke to this, I rattled off the sort of years of various studies, inquiries, and reports. And, you know, it's decades. I only went back like 3 decades, I think, and there's many more before that. What we want to do is look at all of the cumulative recommendations. We know many of them have been repeated. We want to bring these together, and we want to examine why they haven't been acted on. Why has there been a lack of political will? Why has there been a lack of public support? Although that might be changing in the moment. Will that be sustained? I don't know. This is the moment in time to push forward with this. With respect to prison populations, when we know that there is an overrepresentation of people of color, of Black, and of Indigenous, and particularly Indigenous women. And again, Senator Kim Pate is a leader in this field. She was the former head of Elizabeth Fry Canada, and she talked with me about a little known fact, I didn't know it, that the Governor General has the ability to give orders for depopulation of prisons. Now, I know that Elle talked about what's happened in Nova Scotia. There's been similar depopulation in Ontario, but federally, there has been very little done, and there's been many calls for it. So the Governor General has a potential role that they could play in this crisis of COVID, and it takes, the request has to come from 2 privy councillors. So after Kim raised this, Fry and John Howard contacted me, and 2 of us, former Senator Serge Joyal and myself, penned the letter to the Governor General. She has to consult with 1 minister, which would probably be the Public Safety Minister. That went just about a month ago. We got an acknowledgement, but we have not heard back. And I think that there are so many women, and Indigenous women in particular, who could benefit from this. There's criteria, but most of these women are not dangerous offenders, and many of them have been stripped from their children in this circumstance. And this is a time for us to take this kind of step. There was reference earlier to, I think Pam talked about the government and gender-based analysis plus, GBA plus. This is something that has, Senator Nancy Ruth was a huge moving force in getting government to adopt this, but it's still kind of behind closed doors. And when legislation comes in, we don't see the GBA plus that analysis attached to it. And so we are regularly asking for it now and pushing to have it come with bills that are coming into the Senate, and pushing that it should be before the House of Commons as well as they're considering bills. Let's try and move this all the way. And really important that we keep talking about a feminist analysis. Just recently, some of the Nova Scotia senators called on the government several times to introduce a public inquiry into the mass shooting in Nova Scotia, which we all know has gender violence base, to it, that the signs weren't acknowledged, weren't treated seriously, weren't acted on. Well, at least that's what it appears, and we want an inquiry into this. Now, many of us signed on to their letter in support of this. The 2 governments, provincial and federal, announced today that they will be doing an internal-led inquiry where they will probably have external panelists, but it will not be a public inquiry. So there's no guarantee that people will be compelled, summoned to speak, will be under oath. And it is something, but it is not enough. I know that we're very much over on time, so I wanted to give some sense of where work is going on, and it's going on at provincial levels too. So for example, with basic income, British Columbia and PEI are both stepping towards introduction of, or at least another pilot project. I'm tired of pilot projects, but they're moving that in that direction. And if we can get the federal government to work with them to start this process of FedProv territorial work on basic income, we need you all to send the letters. We need you to look at the material that the Basic Income Canada Network is producing and posting. And I think one of the things that we really need to prepare ourselves for, while this provides a moment in time coming through this pandemic where we have more and more evidence about people falling through the cracks of the supports, but again, in particularly women, racialized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, then we know that we could use this as the opportunity, but I think we have to be prepared for what might be an inevitable pushback from governments about an austerity agenda once again. And there are some big things on the table like pharmacare, which at this point in time, we can't even engage in conversation about it because people are so, responding to the immediate crisis. But what an important way forward, and if we want to have some sense of people having incomes and personal equity and have the opportunity for security in their employment, pharmacare is a huge piece of that. It's for many women, it would be immoral to leave a system of support that provides them with the drugs their kids need to go into precarious employment where there's no benefits, no drug plan, and no pension. Childcare, national childcare. Yes, national childcare, is again a framework, and working with the provinces, critically important. We've seen how important it is to the basis of the economy. So a just economy, a just society, and a reimagining of where we can go, and preparing ourselves, girding ourselves with the strategic direction of withstanding another push on austerity that sets us back further again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Senator Lincoln. I just want to let everybody know that Jan has mentioned in the chat that the Zoom meeting, the clock is running out on the actual meeting time. So if we get cut off, we do apologize. Everything again has been recorded, probably unfortunately also the Zoom bombing. Do we have a couple of minutes to do some discussion? What do you think, Jan, Faye?
Absolutely. If we can have an exchange, I know if Pam is still on, and Elle and Bonnie and Angela and with Francis, if you have comments that you want to make with each other, respond to each other, please do.
Okay. What I can do is.
Sorry, I just want to say that unfortunately, Pam Palmiter had to leave because other members of her family needed to be on other calls right now. But I hope if people are available, they're willing to continue a bit of that conversation.
Thanks so much, Faye. What I can do is I've synthesized the comments that populated in the chat, and I've extracted some questions. There were a couple of direct questions. We can perhaps start with one in particular. Bonnie, who works on disability, suggested tax credits as a concrete way in which we can lessen the care penalty on women. Do other panelists have other suggestions? And maybe perhaps Bonnie could expand on this, but do any of you have suggestions as to how we could lessen the burden on
refundable tax credit is one of the key pieces of this, and that's because it currently isn't. One of the unfortunate things that happened through the COVID-19 funding that was sent out through the federal government is that the only funding mechanism they have for really getting money out to people with disabilities is the disability tax credit, which is an extremely difficult program to access for many people with disabilities because, of course, to get the disability tax credit, you have to prove you're disabled. You have to get doctor's notes, forms, the kind of things that are huge barriers to somebody who is poor or who does not have access to the internet, does not have access to resources, to transportation, to all the things you need to get these things done. And so one of the most important things about this is to make the disability tax credit something that anybody who has a disability can apply for, and that it does not mean that you have to qualify, that it is simply available to you if you are a person with a disability and make the claim. So I'm very interested. Like I said, that's one example, but I think there are many issues that the COVID-19 pandemic revealed in that respect, because again, there is no mechanism. And of course, the big issue that the federal government has is when they do transfer payments to the provincial governments then decide what they will do with the money, and there's no assurance that it's actually going to go into the pockets of people with disabilities or that they will claw back their provincial benefits. And so there's a huge problem with just understanding that the basic income of a person with a disability is well below what, for example, was considered to be the minimum a Canadian could live on was $2,000 according to the survey, and that's well above what most people with disabilities receive before, without any of the additional costs that came with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Bonnie. Do any of the other panelists, Senator Lankin, Elle, I'm trying to scan to see who, Angela, have any other concrete suggestions about lessening the penalty on women in the care economy?
Well, for people with disabilities, specifically, the clawback at the provincial level is something that's a huge, huge barrier. So that if there were people with disabilities who were on provincial social assistance or a provincial program and had acknowledged them as a person with a disability, or if they were in some kind of social housing, often that money was getting clawed back and people were ending up even worse off than they were before. And so one of the solutions is obviously better coordination between levels of government to ensure that those types of income payments that are meant to give people a basic income aren't clawed back by other levels of government, whether that be municipal housing or provincial social assistance. But also the provision of universal social services and public services. So making sure that everybody has medication that's free, that you can have dental care that's free, that you have childcare that's free, that reduces everyone's expenses, but it particularly is helpful for people that might have really expensive medical costs and not have employer coverage, right? So, or not quite get qualified on social assistance or any kind of disability program. So when you provide those services for everyone, people who need them a lot benefit. And it's easier than trying to prove that you deserve that benefit. Because often people fall through the cracks when they have to do that.
Thank you. Would we, let's get some last comments in, perhaps from Ellen, from Senator Lankin, as some closing remarks as we wrap up for tonight.
Oh, closing remarks?
Well,
no,
actually, I have a direct question I can ask you both. One was asked directly to Senator Lankin, which is, you know, UBI has been on top of mind for a lot of people, universal basic income. Can we think of a way that universal basic income could be implemented in such a way as not to exacerbate the existing inequities, you know, in our society, particularly when it comes to care or other imbalances for minoritized people? Let me see if I can unmute.
Okay, I think I have it now. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that. So one of the points that I made, I just want to jump back in, is that the energy that's gathering around basic income right now is around a program that is being referred to as basic income, not universal basic income or not guaranteed livable income. And there are lots of debates that we can have about this, but this has worked through community process to center in on this. It is designed to try and use the opportunity to build from CERB to continue to point out who's falling through the cracks of CERB, and to look to how a basic income could cover more. The idea would be an amount that would be whole to a certain point in time, and then not a cliff that you fall off like happens in many support systems, but a reduction over time that takes you up to a middle income area. The reason for that is that the public response and lack of support, until we're seeing that change a bit now again, but has always centered around it would cost too much. It would cost too much in my taxes to support, someone who won't work. It's a disincentive to work. None of the evidence supports that. None of the evidence supports that it is a disincentive to work. And in fact, it unleashes creativity, opportunity for education, opportunity to try, employment opportunities, and it has a safety net aspect to it. To help people. There's a lot more detail than that, and there isn't the time to go into it. But I hope that people will go and look at and connect with their local group that belongs to the Basic Income Canada Network, because they're doing some fabulous work, and they're building a head of steam behind this. With many economists commenting now, many sectors, like I mentioned, the arts and others coming in behind this. And, maybe it is a place where we can pierce through the veil of finance and try and accomplish something here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Elle, why don't I throw you another question as our closing question.
Sure.
It's a rather big one, but it's, how do we make EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, an actual policy across sectors in Canada for true equity in gender, race, class, and ability? Is there a way to, make this a kind of policy across sectors?
That's what you asked me. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I think, again, I always think that one cannot just paper over deep structural inequities. So it is not my belief that, simply if we add more women to boards, or, we have some more Black people in the Dalhousie Senate or whatever it is, that we are therefore moving forward. I, in fact, think often those things become cover-ups for broader inequality. So, for example, in diversity hiring, what we often see is more radical, particularly like radical Black women, are then shut out even more completely from positions. People with much less radical positions who fit a diversity bill but aren't advocating the same things are able to get in kind of off our backs. So one of the dangers of like this moment in a Black Lives Matter moment is that traditionally, and that's true for feminism, that's true for Black liberation struggles, it's true for Indigenous struggles, that often what we end up with is a few more tokenistic jobs, a few more grants. And what we haven't done is actually address the reason why poor people, youth, these people are going in the streets and risking their lives, and we're not risking our lives, and people particularly who are in so many precarious positions don't go out and risk their lives night after night and put their bodies on the line and their health on the line for a couple of grants. That's not why we're out here. So I think it's really important that we shift that language from kind of policy into actual liberation. I believe in liberation. I believe that we can seek it in our lifetimes, that it's not just an imagination. I believe we can seek it now. And like I said, we often talk about imagining futures, imagining Black futures, but one of the things that we did see in COVID is that it wasn't imaginary, that we could do these things. So I no longer really talk about imagining it, because we can install it. If we really wanted to and had the will, we could have the future that we want. So, we're always told that those are broad visions. We're always told, well, that's radical and ridiculous. But it is actually, what is radical is to continue to believe in prisons. What is radical is to continue to hold people in poverty. What is radical is to continue to not provide people the access they need in order to lead a full and whole life. Those things are actually radical things to do, because they are not human, and they are reflections not just of, this moment, but of a deeply sick society that we have, that is reflected in misogyny, that is reflected in racism, that is reflected in all of these things. And until we address that sickness, we cannot simply, put a Band-Aid on it and say, well, we need more people on the board. And I'm not saying it's wrong to be on a board. I'm not saying we shouldn't have more women senators or more women parliamentarians. Of course we should, because when we have equality, those things will happen. When people have childcare, they can run for office. When people have a job and a safe house and like that, what they need, they can do the things they need to do for life, as is we're talking about in the discussion of income, right? That when it actually opens people up. So for me, I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom for everybody. I believe that nobody should have to leave their home because it's unsafe, and everybody should be able to stay where they want, move where they want. I believe that we can open the prison doors. I believe that we can stop policing each other and find justice in our communities. I believe that we can heal sexual violence. And I don't say it's easy. I don't think it's not complex. I don't think it doesn't challenge us every day. I don't think we have don't make mistakes. I don't think that we insufficiently don't live up to our values. All those things happen and happen all the time. We fail ourselves all the time, but I still believe we push forward. So for me, installing those values is about living it out every day. And I am an abolitionist, but I am an everyday abolitionist. And that means I believe in the deep complexity of human life. It means that I implicate myself in all the ways that I harm others and the ways our systems harm others. And all I can do as a person is acknowledge that complexity and learn from it and move forward. And I ask that of other people as well in our society. If we all did that, we could start to find accountability and care for each other. And when we do that, we wouldn't need to sort of address what racism is and address what ableism is and address this, because we would be living it out. So that is a big vision. In the short term, so when you're like, okay, but Elle, the prison ain't ending tomorrow, so what are you doing? So in the short term, around our communities, I believe we can practice this. I believe we can practice conflict intervention, get to know our neighbors, help people. Can I bring you groceries? Can I drive you somewhere? I see you don't have access, can I shovel your walk? These are things we can do for each other that begin practices of justice with ourselves and with each other. And when we start to do that, we start to build a different relationship with each other and with land, you know, with even, you know, how we relate. And from there, we start to build and see each other as more human and see each other as more capable. We need to give people the tools for liberation. We need to build tenancy boards that fight our landlords so that everybody has stable housing. We can do that. We need to take over empty homes, and like we see mothers taking over squats. We need to do these things. We need to get out there every day and just fight where we are. And every single one of us has a capacity, not at all times, right? And everybody doesn't have the same capacities. Like, not everybody can go stand in the street because they are like actually have a chronic illness, right? So we don't ask that of everybody in the same way, but everybody has capabilities. Every single person has capabilities, and we tap into those capabilities with each other. And in there we find justice. That's a long answer, but I challenge all people, not just institutions, but all of us, just normal people, to every day ask ourselves, what it is can I do to make this world a little more just? What can I challenge in myself? What ideas do I hold that, you know, when have I sided with oppression, and how do I see that in myself? And I believe in that process. I believe it's complex, I believe it's hard, and I believe it's challenging, but I believe it's possible.
Thank you so much. This is a great note to end on. I'd like to thank Pam Palmiter, Bonnie Braden, Elle Jones, Angela McEwen, Senator Francis Lankin, and Mary Clarke Walker. And I'll hand it over to Faye and Jan for just closing remarks. Thank you, everybody. Bonne soirée.
Thanks very much. We'll keep this short. Just a big thank you, obviously, to Pam, to Bonnie, to Elle, to Angela, to Francis for all of your words. Faye and I've both put up big thanks to everybody. Thanks to all the participants. This is just a start. Our next webinar is August 12th on looking at the care economy. I have to say that this conversation has helped shift and reset part of that discussion in very important and significant ways. During that next webinar, we'll have breakout rooms so everybody can have a chance to chat with each other more. But, you know, I think rising together, we can create this just economy. So thank you all for your inspiration. Faye.
Thank you so much. I just want to say quickly that the economy isn't something that exists in the wild outside of the choices that we make and the values that we choose to institutionalize in our societies. And so I think this is an important call to really build an economy that serves us as people, as human beings, that serves us to have a supportive and integrated community, and that does so in a way that doesn't destroy the planet. So I really thank all of the speakers for taking us right down to the really deep work that we need to do that sets the foundation for this. And I really look forward to the conversations that will unroll over the next few months. Please continue to join us. We will be posting all sorts of resources, as I said, on our website. Mm-hmm. We will send out notices for the upcoming webinars. And we look forward to continuing this work with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Good night. See you in August.
Good night. August 12th.